All right, so we're going to dive into something today that's really important for environmental health officers out there, especially those of you working for UK councils. When you're looking at a case and you're trying to decide, do I actually go ahead and prosecute this?
Yeah, that's a tough decision, isn't it? It's a real balancing act. You've got to weigh that evidence, you've got to consider the public interest, and of course, you always have to think about what the impact of your decision is actually going to be.
Exactly. It's like,
Yeah.
it's a lot to think about.
Mm.
And that's why, I guess, that's why we're diving into these two legal documents today.
Right.
The first one is the Code for Crown Prosecutors. That was published back in October of 2018. And then we have Simple Cautions for Adult Offenders. That's from April 2015.
Yep. And those are really they're really important documents because they can sort of help us understand the landscape, can't they? And and kind of approach these decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And the first one, the Code for Crown Prosecutors,
Yeah.
that sounds a little, I don't know. It sounds kind of intimidating, to be honest.
Yeah.
Does that really apply to me as an EHO?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It applies to you. See, this isn't just for those barristers, the ones in the wigs and gowns.
Right.
It's much broader than that. What it does is it lays out some of the fundamental principles that guide prosecution decisions. And that applies to anybody who's actually making those decisions.
Okay. So it does apply to EHOs,
Yeah, absolutely.
like you.
Okay. Phew. All right. So what is it really saying then? What's the kind of core message of the code?
Well, at its heart, really, it's emphasizing your independence as a prosecutor.
Mm.
So what that means is you're free from any kind of pressure, any kind of outside pressure. So that could be political influence, it could be media hype, it could even be your own personal feelings about the case.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So like if I'm like really annoyed at this person because they like keep, I don't know, dumping rubbish in the same spot, I can't let that affect my
Exactly. You have to stay objective.
judgment.
Yeah. You've got to remember, at this point, you're not the one deciding guilt or innocence. All you're doing is you're deciding if there's enough evidence to take it to court. And then the court will decide.
Right. Okay. That's a really important distinction, I think.
Yeah.
So how do we know if there is like actually enough evidence? Like how do we make that judgment call?
Well, that's where the full code test comes in. It's really famous. I'm sure you've heard of it. And it's a two-stage process.
Okay.
So it helps you analyze the evidence, and then you can weigh the public interest. The first stage is called the evidential stage.
Okay. The evidential stage. That sounds pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah.
Is it basically just about making sure we've got, enough evidence to get a conviction?
It's a little more complex than that. It's you've got to think about whether the evidence is admissible in court. Can you actually use it?
Right.
Is it reliable? Is it credible? And then you've also got to factor in like any potential defenses that the suspect might raise.
So like let's say I've got this case. Someone's like fly tipping and there's a witness who saw someone doing it, but like they didn't really get a very good look at who it was. Would that be enough to kind of like pass the evidential stage?
That's when things get a little tricky
Right.
because the witness testimony is useful, but it might not be enough on its own. You probably need some corroborating evidence.
So like what kind of thing? Like CCTV?
Yeah, CCTV footage.
Or like fingerprints maybe?
Fingerprints, maybe even documentation that links the waste to a specific person
Okay.
or a business.
So it's kind of like it's like putting together a puzzle almost.
Mm.
You got to make sure all the pieces fit.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so let's say we do have a good case. We've gone through the evidence. It all checks out. What happens next?
Then we move on to the second stage. This is the public interest stage of the full code test. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Oh, okay. Why is that?
Because even if you have like a really solid case, you might decide that prosecution isn't actually the best way to go.
Right.
Because this stage makes you consider the wider impact.
Right. Yeah, because, sometimes it can feel a bit like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut,
Yeah. Yeah.
like taking them to court, especially like if it's quite a minor offense.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the public interest things, like factors that we need to be thinking about?
Oh, well, there are a whole bunch of factors that are actually listed in the code, and some of them are, particularly relevant to environmental health cases
Okay.
like yours. For example, you've got to think about how serious the offense actually is
Right.
and the harm that it's caused. So, for instance, was there a big impact on public health? Right.
or on the environment.
So like a small restaurant that has a couple of hygiene issues, that wouldn't be like treated the same way as like a, I don't know, like a big factory that's dumping hazardous waste illegally.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
The level of harm is really important.
Mm.
But you've also got to think about, the culpability of the suspect. So did they act deliberately? Were they reckless? Or, was it just negligence? Were they aware of the risks?
Right.
Those sorts of things.
And what about the impact on the community? So like if a whole neighborhood is like really suffering because of what someone is doing, surely that's got to like carry a lot of weight, right?
Absolutely. The code specifically talks about the impact on vulnerable groups
Okay.
and the wider community. And then you've also got to think about, is it proportionate
Right.
to prosecute them? Would the penalties actually be fitting considering the cost and all the resources that are involved?
Right. So it's all about finding that kind of that sweet spot, really.
That balance between like the need for justice, but also the the practicalities of it all.
Yeah.
And the impact on everyone.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
It is. It's a lot to think about. But, luckily the code does give you a framework to kind of like to work through that.
Right.
And it's not just about prosecution. It also highlights some alternatives, like simple cautions, which we'll come to. Those can be really helpful.
Okay, yeah. Simple cautions.
Oh, yeah.
That's interesting. So that's kind of like a middle ground then
Yeah, you could say that.
between doing nothing and actually going for like a full-blown prosecution.
Right. And that's actually where our second document comes in, simple cautions for adult offenders.
Okay. So let's explore that then. What's the deal with simple cautions?
Well, think of it as a formal warning
Okay.
to someone over 18 who's admitted that they've committed a minor offense. It's basically a way to deal with wrongdoing without going to court.
Right. So instead of ending up in front of a judge, they might just get like a stern talking to and a warning to kind of, change their behavior.
Yeah, exactly. It's a way to hold people accountable,
Right.
but also encourage them to learn from what they've done. But there are, some rules around it.
Yeah, I bet.
It's not a free pass.
So when are they appropriate then? Like what are the conditions?
Well, first things first. The person has to admit that they're guilty. They have to own up to it.
Right.
If they're denying any kind of involvement, then that's it. No caution.
So like if someone says like, "Oh, I didn't know I was doing anything wrong," when they were, dumping waste illegally, that's not gonna fly.
No, they have to take responsibility for what they've done.
Yeah, okay.
And even if they do admit it, you've still got the full code test to go through.
Right.
You still need to assess the evidence and think about, is it really in the public interest? All those things.
So it's not just a, sorry card.
Right.
You're still going through those careful considerations that we talked about before.
Exactly. And then there are also certain offenses where you simply can't give a caution.
Okay.
Doesn't matter what. So repeat offenses, they're generally not suitable for a caution.
Okay.
Because if someone has a history of similar offenses, they're probably going to end up in court.
Makes sense. Yeah. If they haven't been deterred by a warning before,
Exactly.
it's probably not going to work this time either.
So are there any other situations where it's kind of like off the table then?
Yeah, there are. There are specific categories of offenses, like, if it involves violence or sexual offenses or like serious drug offenses.
Right.
Those are generally not considered for cautions. The simple cautions guidance, it actually lists all these out in Annex D.
Okay.
So you can check that if you need to. Okay, I'll look at that. So let's say we have a first-time offender. They've admitted to, a relatively minor offense. And it seems like a caution might be, the right way to go.
Right.
What else is involved in the decision-making then?
Okay, so you've got to assess how serious the offense actually is. So that includes what the potential penalties would be if they were prosecuted. And then, were there any aggravating factors or mitigating factors?
Well, okay.
You'll want to think about the offender's background, if they have any vulnerabilities.
So like their personal circumstances do come into play.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just one size fits all. And although you should definitely consider the victim's views,
Right.
you're the authorized officer who makes the final decision about whether to actually issue a caution.
Gosh, it's a lot of responsibility.
It is.
But it does sound quite fascinating, actually,
Yeah.
to sort of, weigh all those factors and consider, the individual and everything, and actually make that judgment call.
Yeah.
It's really, really interesting.
It is. And, it's all about achieving the right outcome, right? Sometimes that means going to court, but other times a simple caution is just, it's the most effective way and it's the most appropriate way
Okay.
to deal with the situation.
So we've talked about the Code for Crown Prosecutors.
Right.
We've kind of dipped our toes into this world of simple cautions. Before we go any further, I think it's good to remember, who this is actually for, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. This is for all you environmental health officers out there.
Yeah.
You're the ones on the front lines. You're making these really tough decisions every day.
Yeah.
You're the ones who are ensuring the safety and well-being of your communities.
So let's bring it back to your world then. Imagine you're out there, you're investigating a potential environmental health violation.
Right.
What are some real situations where a simple caution might actually be the right call?
Okay. So let's imagine you're dealing with a noise nuisance case.
Okay.
So you've got a resident and they keep having like really loud parties late at night.
Right.
And it's really disturbing the neighbors.
Okay, yeah.
They've already been given warnings,
Right.
but it's still happening.
So like a public nuisance kind of thing. So what can we do there?
Right. You could think about prosecution,
Yeah.
but is it really necessary?
Mhm.
Remember the full code test.
Right. Yeah.
So let's say, for example, the evidential stage, that's been met.
Okay, so we've got like witness statements and noise recordings,
Yeah.
maybe even a log of those previous warnings.
Yeah, exactly. So now you're at the public interest stage.
Right. So what would make us think, okay, a caution might be a better idea in this situation?
Okay, well, think about how serious the offense is.
Okay.
While the noise is disruptive, it's probably not causing, serious harm.
Right.
The person is obviously, culpable.
Yeah.
But maybe they just haven't fully understood what the impact of their actions is.
Okay.
So a caution might be a good way to, address the issue and deter them from doing it again.
Right.
Without having to actually go to court.
Right. Yeah.
But, and this is a really important but, they need to admit that they're in the wrong.
Right.
If they're still denying there's a problem, a caution's not going to do anything.
Right. So a simple caution can be a good way to resolve things.
Yeah.
But only if they, actually take responsibility for their actions.
Exactly. It's not just a way of letting people off. It's about achieving, a good outcome, something that's proportionate, but also encourages them to make a change.
Okay, yeah. I'm starting to see how this works in real life, But I mean, not every case is going to be this straightforward, is it?
You're absolutely right. Sometimes, the lines get a bit blurry.
Yeah.
And it's not always clear if a caution is the right way to go.
Right. Let's explore some of those trickier situations then in part 2 of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
We'll be right back after a short break.
So, welcome back to our deep dive into enforcement, especially for those of you who are environmental health officers.
Yeah, we're picking up right where we left off, looking at the kind of practical side of simple cautions and thinking about those cases where the decision isn't always so easy,
Those trickier ones.
Yeah, those gray areas.
Exactly.
And I think, maybe a real example might help us to kind of see those gray areas a bit more clearly.
Yeah, perfect. Hit me with it.
All right, so picture this. You're dealing with a small business, and they haven't been disposing of their waste oil properly.
They say that they didn't, they weren't aware of the proper procedures.
Right.
But when you start digging a little deeper, you find some evidence that suggests maybe they were cutting corners.
Uh-oh.
To save money.
So maybe there's some negligence there, or even a deliberate attempt to kind of get around the rules. That does make it a bit more serious, doesn't it?
It does, because now the potential harm to the environment, that's greater.
Right.
And this business might be trying to avoid taking responsibility for what they've done. So, in this case, that could be a good argument for prosecution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we still need to think about that public interest stage of the full code test, right?
Of course.
So even if we've got really strong evidence, are there ever times when a caution might still be an option in a case like this?
Yeah, there are. So imagine this business, it's a small family-run place, and they've been, struggling a bit financially. They admit they made a mistake. They're really sorry about it. And they immediately do everything they can to put things right.
Right.
So they put new procedures in place, they cooperate with you fully, and they even offer to clean up any mess they made.
So although what they did wasn't okay, it seems like they're really genuine
Yeah.
about making amends. And they've actually taken steps to stop it happening again.
Exactly. So, in that situation, maybe a caution would be better. Maybe you'd combine it with, I don't know, maybe they have to do some environmental training
Right.
or pay a small fine. That might be more proportionate
Yeah.
than actually taking them to court. And it means you're addressing the violation, but you're also incentivizing them to comply.
Yeah.
And you might be saving a small business that's, genuinely trying to do better.
It's a real balancing act, isn't it?
It is.
Trying to be like, enforcing the rules, but also understanding, trying to find that balance between, justice and compassion.
Yeah, in a lot of these cases, you have to use your judgment, and think about all the different details.
Right. Okay. So that's a really good example.
Yeah.
But that makes me think about the kind of, those situations where a caution might not be the right thing at all.
Right.
Like, what are some of the warning signs, that would make you think, actually, we need to prosecute this?
Yeah. There are definitely some scenarios where you'd probably need a stronger response, like any offense where someone's deliberately harming the environment or putting public health at risk. It's a big one.
Yeah. So you mean those cases where, like, someone's, deliberately polluting a river or something.
Exactly.
Or dumping hazardous waste, and they know that they're putting people and wildlife in danger.
Yeah, those aren't oops moments, That's just a complete disregard for the law and for public safety. And then you've got those repeat offenders, especially the ones who've already ignored warnings or previous cautions.
Yeah.
So if someone just keeps breaking environmental regulations and they've made no effort to change, then you might need a more serious response to actually protect the community and the environment.
Yeah. It's like, what's that saying? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Exactly.
At some point, you just, you have to take a stand. And then another thing that would be a red flag, I guess, is if the person just doesn't seem to care.
Yeah.
Or if they refuse to cooperate at all with the investigation.
Right. So if they're obstructive or dismissive, or if they try to cover up what they've done, then that's probably a sign that a caution's not going to work.
Yeah, it's the lack of, accountability.
Exactly.
If they're not willing to admit what they did and show that they actually want to make things right, then it's hard to see how a caution is going to make any difference.
Absolutely. And then finally, you might think about prosecution. If the case involves vulnerable people or really sensitive environments. So if what they did has really badly affected a community or a protected species,
Right.
or a fragile ecosystem, then you might need that stronger response to show that you're serious about protecting them.
So it's about, protecting those who can't protect themselves, really.
Exactly.
And holding people accountable for harming, the environment or the most vulnerable people. Okay, gosh, I feel like I'm getting a much better understanding now of how to approach all this.
Good.
But I'm sure there's, even more to it than what we've talked about. What else should we cover before we finish up this deep dive?
Well, we've talked about when to use simple cautions and why.
Right.
But what about the practical side of it? What do you actually do when you're giving someone a caution?
Yeah, that's a good point. Because it's not just about saying you've been cautioned.
Yeah.
There's a whole process, isn't there, to make sure it's all done properly.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to look at in the last part of our deep dive. We'll go through the whole process step by step.
Yeah.
So you know exactly what to do if you decide that a caution is the right way to go.
Perfect. Let's do it. We'll be right back after a short break. OAK Lissy Shuvesa. We'll be right back after a short break.
Okay, so welcome back to the deep dive. We've been looking at, the tricky decisions that environmental health officers have to make all the time, like whether or not to actually prosecute.
Right. We've been talking about the code for Crown Prosecutors and how simple cautions can be a really useful alternative, haven't we?
Yeah, exactly. And I guess in this last part, we're going to get really, really practical, aren't we?
We are. We're going to walk you through the whole process, step by step.
Okay, yeah, of actually issuing a caution.
Exactly.
Because it's not, it's not just as easy as just saying to someone, right, you've been cautioned.
No, definitely not. There's a procedure, a proper procedure, and we need to make sure we follow it. Okay, yeah, for sure, to make sure it's, done properly, fairly.
Yeah.
So take it away. Talk us through it.
All right. So, before we even get into the details, we need to double check. make sure that a simple caution really is the right thing for this specific situation. So remember all those things we talked about, like the full code test.
Yeah.
The offender needs to admit they're guilty. And there are some types of offenses where you just can't use a caution.
Right. Yeah. We've been through all that in quite a bit of detail already. So let's assume we've done all those checks. We're happy that a caution is the right way to go.
Okay.
What's next? What's the next step?
Well, now you need to have a conversation with the offender. And it's really important. You need to explain to them exactly what it means if they accept this caution.
Okay.
This isn't just like a slap on the wrist. There are some consequences. They need to know what those consequences are.
Right. So it's a bit more serious than just like a telling off.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's really important that they understand this is an official record
Right.
of what they've done wrong. It's going to be on their criminal record.
Oh, wow.
And it could come up, later on.
Okay.
So think about, if they're applying for a job.
Right.
Or a visa. Or, even if they're trying to volunteer somewhere, sometimes they do background checks.
Right.
It could show up.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought about all those situations. Gosh, it does kind of highlight that it's not something to be taken lightly.
Exactly. And you need to be honest with them about that. Tell them that it might make some things harder for them in the future. Like, for instance, there are some jobs they might not be able to do.
Right.
Especially, if they want to work with children.
Yeah.
Or vulnerable adults.
Yeah. Okay. That's a pretty heavy conversation.
Right.
So we've explained all that. They know what the implications are.
Right.
What do we do then?
Well, this is the crucial bit. We need to get their consent. They have to agree to accept the caution.
Right.
You can't just force it on them.
So what if they just say, no, I don't want it?
Then you have to go back and kind of reassess, really.
Okay.
It might mean you have to think about prosecuting them after all.
Right.
Or maybe there are other alternatives you can explore. Or, sometimes if it's really not in the public interest to do anything else, then maybe you just have to leave it.
Yeah. Okay. So it's back to the drawing board. But let's say they do agree. They say, okay, I'll accept the caution.
Okay, great. So then you need to make it all official.
Right.
Usually there's a form, a simple caution form that they have to sign.
Okay. What sort of things are on that form then?
Well, it'll have, details about the offense, the offender's details. It'll say that they've admitted to being guilty.
Right.
And that they're accepting the caution. And it might have like a summary of all those implications that we just talked about.
Okay, so it's a written record then of everything.
Yeah, a paper trail. And you'll sign it as well as the authorized officer.
Right.
And the offender will get a copy to keep.
So once that's signed, that's it. The caution's official.
Almost.
Yeah.
You also need to make sure you update all the databases.
Yeah.
The records.
Right.
So it shows that the caution's been issued.
So it's not just about that conversation and the paperwork. It's making sure everything's like documented and logged properly for the future.
Exactly. Yeah. Good record keeping is really important.
Yeah.
So, for transparency.
Yeah.
And for accountability.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've gone from looking at the offense right through to explaining everything, getting their consent, and then actually making the caution official.
Right.
Is there anything else that we need to be thinking about during this whole process?
Yeah, there are just a couple more things that I think are really important. First of all, just always remember to be, sensitive.
Right.
And respectful. You're upholding the law, but you're also dealing with a person.
Yeah.
And they might be, embarrassed, stressed out, even a bit scared.
So be firm but fair.
Yeah, exactly. And the second thing is make sure you're up to date with any local policies, or procedures. In your area, there might be specific forms that you have to use, or certain officers who have to handle this.
Okay.
Or maybe there are extra steps you need to take. It might be a bit different where you are.
So check your local protocols.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about consistency. But you also need to be flexible sometimes. Remember, these legal documents, they give you guidance, but ultimately it's you who's making the decisions,
Yeah, that's true. Right, well, I feel like we've covered loads today. We started out feeling a bit intimidated by all the legal stuff, and now I actually feel like I could go out there and use this in real life.
That's great. That's what we wanted.
Yeah, so any last words of wisdom for our listeners out there before we wrap this up?
Well, as environmental health officers, you guys, you're doing a really important job. You're protecting public health. You're protecting the environment. The decisions you make, they really do make a difference to people's lives, to communities.
It is a lot of
It
responsibility.
is.
But I think, what we've talked about today, it's given us the knowledge and the understanding to approach these decisions with confidence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
And those documents, the code for Crown prosecutors, the guidance on simple cautions, those are your tools. Get to know them, use them wisely, and don't forget, you're not on your own. You know.
You've got your colleagues, you've got legal experts you can talk to.
Exactly.
Yeah, don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it, especially if it's a difficult case. And I guess the main thing is just keep learning. You know,
Yeah.
things are always changing in the world of environmental health. So you have to keep up to date.
Mm.
So, yeah, as you go out there and do this really important work, just remember to be fair,
Yeah,
be consistent, and, do what you think is right.
absolutely.
So, as always, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, stay curious.
And keep learning.
Yeah.